My name is Seraphina. I am 30 years old, and my billionaire father chose my wedding day to publicly destroy my life. Standing before 500 of New York City's most powerful elites in the grand ballroom, my dad aggressively hijacked. The microphone stared me dead in the eyes and announced that I was being stripped of my inheritance, my executive title, and that my trust fund was permanently deleted. He expected me to drop to my knees and beg for mercy. Instead, my new husband smiled, looked my billionaire father right in the eye, and told him we didn't need a single cent of his toxic money. Exactly 3 months later, my parents completely froze when they walked into a high-stakes corporate meeting and realized who my husband actually worked for. Before I tell you how we systematically dismantled their entire retail empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe right now if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who thought their money gave them the right to buy your obedience. Growing up in a penthouse as the only daughter of the Avery global retail empire, my life was never treated as a precious gift. It was treated as a series of cold, calculated corporate transactions. In my family's world, every single thing had a sharp price tag, including love, loyalty, and basic human respect. My father, Arthur Avery, built his retail kingdom from the ground up with ruthless, bloodless efficiency, and he demanded absolute totalitarian control over every aspect of our lives. My mother, Eleanor, was his perfect ice-cold counterpart, a high society matriarch who valued designer labels, prestigious zip codes, and social standing far above the soul of her own daughter. Together, they expected me to be a quiet, compliant corporate asset. My assigned role in life was simple: marry whichever Wall Street banking heir they handpicked, merge our massive stock portfolios, and continue expanding the family wealth. Instead, I committed the ultimate cardinal sin. I fell in love with Julian. Julian was brilliant, fiercely kind, and possessed a rock-solid moral compass that my family's twisted, greedy minds simply could not comprehend. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, dedicating his time to managing a grassroots community arts nonprofit that funded creative outlets for underprivileged kids in the poorest neighborhoods of Brooklyn. He drove a beat-up Ford Mustang, lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, and cared deeply about making a tangible, honest difference in the world. I loved his passion, his raw integrity, and the way he made me feel completely seen for who I was, not what my last name could buy. My father, however, hated him with a burning, vindictive passion. He saw Julian as a financial parasite, a liability, and a personal insult to the prestigious Avery legacy. When I refused to break off the engagement, my parents decided to turn my wedding day into a public execution. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the plaza. I had spent months meticulously planning every single detail, foolishly believing that a beautiful ceremony might finally bridge the icy gap between my family and me. The tables were draped in imported silk linens, and a world-class string quartet played softly, creating a flawless illusion of perfect harmony. The room was dripping in white orchids, massive crystal chandeliers, and heavy gold accents. It looked like a fairy tale, but the psychological tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. I stood at the head table beside Julian. He wore a simple, off-the-rack rented suit that he had carefully tailored himself. He looked incredibly handsome, but he was completely out of place among the sea of custom Tom Ford tuxedos and haute couture gowns. The room was packed with billionaires, corporate board members, and fashion icons. These were people who relied heavily on my father for their own financial success, people who would never dare to cross him. Suddenly, the sharp clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne glass brought the massive ballroom to a sudden dead halt. Arthur Avery stood up. Without saying a single word, my father aggressively snatched the microphone from the stand. The entire room fell perfectly silent. You could hear a pin drop on the polished marble floor. I expected a stiff, polite toast. Instead, my father turned to face us, his expression twisting into a cruel, triumphant sneer. He tapped the microphone twice the sharp, hollow sounds cutting through the tense atmosphere, and his voice boomed through the surrounding speakers. He did not welcome Julian to the family. Arthur looked directly at the crowd and announced that he refused to watch his life's work be squandered on a pathetic mistake. He turned his cold gaze to Julian, making a deliberate mocking show of inspecting his inexpensive suit. He told the entire room that an Avery Global executive marrying a penniless charity worker was an absolute joke. He declared that because I had stubbornly refused his demands, he was making an executive decision right then and there. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs, but I locked my knees and forced myself to stand tall under the blinding spotlight. Arthur declared that I was officially stripped of my title as Chief of Operations at Avery Global, effectively firing me in front of all my professional peers. He loudly proclaimed that my access to the $200 million family trust fund was permanently revoked. He signaled the hotel staff to immediately cancel the catering service, loudly declaring that he would not pay another dime for this embarrassment. He then turned to his corporate security team, instructing them to guard the exit doors, just in case we decided to cause a scene. The wealthy guests murmured, shifting uncomfortably, but no one moved to intervene. I looked at my mother, Eleanor, hoping for a single shred of maternal defense. Instead, she stood up, slowly, took the microphone, and let out a long, dramatic sigh, performing her role as the long-suffering parent perfectly. She looked at me with utter disgust. She told the crowd that they had always known I lacked the fierce ambition of my older brother Tristan. She said I had always been too soft, too distracted by silly charitable causes, and completely incapable of handling the serious pressures of the family empire. She laughed a cold, empty laugh and added that the family would just have to rely entirely on Tristan to carry the torch. I turned my gaze to my older brother. Tristan sat at the center of the head table, basking in the glow of their praise. He was the undisputed golden child of the family, a man who had never faced a single consequence in his life. He did not look shocked. He looked absolutely thrilled. Tristan smirked at me, picked up his $8,000 glass of vintage wine, and raised it high in the air. It was a mock salute to my public humiliation. Growing up, Tristan had always stolen the credit for my hard work. I was the one working 80-hour weeks to optimize our e-commerce logistics. Tristan was the one playing golf with clients and presenting my proprietary data models as his own brilliant strategy. My parents knew this perfectly well, but they simply did not care. Tristan was the male heir. I was just the workhorse expected to stay in the shadows. By choosing Julian, I had broken their golden rule, and this public execution was my ultimate punishment. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. My father sat down, adjusting his tie, waiting for me to break down. They fully expected me to cry. They expected me to beg, but I did not shed a single tear. Looking at the smug faces of my family, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. For 30 years, I had allowed them to dictate my worth. I realized that their wealth was just a golden cage, and they had just handed me my freedom. I felt a warm, strong hand slip into mine. Julian stepped closer to me, a solid, calming anchor in the middle of the storm. He did not look embarrassed by his suit or intimidated by a room full of hostile billionaires. He looked completely at peace. He reached out and smoothly took the microphone from the stand before the singer could put it away. Julian looked directly at my father. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying confidence that made the entire ballroom freeze. He smiled warmly and his voice carried clearly over the speakers. "Keep your money, Arthur," Julian said smoothly. "We don't need a single cent of the Avery fortune." He held my hand tighter, making sure everyone heard his next words. He leaned into the microphone and whispered a promise that sent a shiver down my spine. "Because in exactly 3 months, Avery Global will be begging for ours." He set the microphone down on the table. He turned to me, offered his arm, and we walked out of the ballroom together, leaving my family sitting in stunned, furious silence. The heavy gilded double doors of the plaza's grand ballroom slammed shut behind us, cutting off the suffocating silence of the 500 elite guests we left behind. The transition from the blinding crystal chandeliers to the dim carpeted hallway felt like stepping out of an interrogation room. My chest heaved as the raw adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I looked down at our intertwined hands. Julian's grip was warm, steady, and unyielding. He didn't say a word. He just pulled me close, shielding me from the lingering stares of the hotel staff who had undoubtedly overheard my father's booming, destructive announcement. We bypassed the main lobby, avoiding the flashing cameras of the society paparazzi waiting outside, and slipped out through a quiet side exit onto the chilly, windswept pavement of Fifth Avenue. The cold New York City air hit my face, shocking my system back to reality. Julian guided me toward his beat-up 10-year-old Ford Mustang parked near the curb. It was a stark contrast to the line of pristine, blacked-out Lamborghinis and Rolls-Royces lining the hotel entrance, but tonight that dented metal frame felt like a life raft. I slid into the passenger seat, my extravagant, custom-designed wedding gown pooling awkwardly around my feet in the cramped space. Julian started the engine, and the familiar low rumble of the motor filled the cabin. As he navigated through the heavy Manhattan traffic heading toward the Williamsburg Bridge, I leaned my head against the cool glass window, watching the glittering skyscrapers blur into streaks of neon light. I felt incredibly light, yet entirely untethered. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to his modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet industrial corner of Brooklyn. We climbed the 3 flights of creaking stairs in absolute silence, the heavy train of my dress rustling against the concrete steps. When Julian unlocked the door, the familiar scent of oil paints, old books, and clean linen washed over me. It was a world completely removed from the sterile museum-like perfection of my family's Upper East Side penthouse. Julian turned to me, gently unpinning the heavy tulle veil from my hair and setting it on the small kitchen counter. He looked into my eyes with a soft, protective intensity. He told me he was proud of me and that we were going to build something real together, far away from the shadow of Avery Global. I woke up the next morning as the bright sun filtered through the cheap, thin blinds of the bedroom, casting long shadows across the slightly lumpy mattress. For a split second, my mind expected the smooth touch of imported Egyptian cotton sheets and the quiet hum of the central air conditioning from my former high-rise apartment. Instead, I heard the distant, rhythmic rumble of the subway and the steady, comforting sound of Julian's breathing beside me. The lavish wedding, the whispering crowds, and my father's cruel, booming voice echoing through the microphone felt like a distant, distorted nightmare. I sat up quietly, careful not to disturb my sleeping husband, and reached for my phone resting on the wooden nightstand. The screen immediately illuminated, displaying a barrage of notifications that made my stomach twist into a tight knot. I had 45 missed calls and over 100 unread text messages from society acquaintances, distant relatives, and corporate executives. The news of the Avery family execution had traveled through the elite social circles of New York like a wildfire. I ignored every single one of them, refusing to give their gossip an ounce of my energy. I cleared the notifications and opened my banking app instead. My father had loudly canceled the massive catering check last night, and I needed to quickly transfer my own independent funds to ensure the working-class hotel staff and local vendors got paid. They didn't deserve to suffer just because Arthur Avery threw a public tantrum. I typed in my secure passcode and waited for the application to load. When the primary screen finally popped up, my heart completely stopped beating. The bold black numbers at the top of my personal checking account read a devastating 0. I blinked, assuming it was a temporary digital glitch, and swiped down to aggressively refresh the interface. The screen flashed, but the devastating 0 remained stubbornly in place. A cold, suffocating wave of panic began to claw at my throat. I rapidly switched tabs to view my high-yield savings account, the secure reservoir, where I had been meticulously depositing my independent consulting fees from European fashion brands since I was 17 years old. That account held my Independent Freedom Fund, entirely separate from Avery Global. It too read 0. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck as my hands began to shake uncontrollably. This wasn't corporate money. This was my personal hard-earned cash, built from a decade of grueling late-night operational strategies. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing a worn sweater, and dialed the emergency customer service line for my wealth management bank. After 20 agonizing minutes of listening to hold music, a deeply nervous representative finally answered. He verified my identity, his tone instantly shifting to one of profound discomfort when he pulled up my financial profile. He informed me that a total asset freeze and immediate wire transfer had been executed at exactly 5 o'clock that morning. I demanded to know how someone could possibly drain my private accounts without a court order or my direct written authorization. The representative swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he explained the crushing legal reality deep within the fine print. The accounts had originally been opened as custodial accounts by my parents when I was a minor. Because I had never filed the complex, official paperwork to formally remove my father as the legal custodian. After I turned 18, Arthur Avery still retained full administrative privileges. My father had ruthlessly exploited a malicious legal loophole using his immense billionaire status and an aggressive team of corporate lawyers to suffocate me financially before the sun had even fully risen over the city. I ended the call, the dead tone buzzing in my ear, and tossed the phone onto the blanket. I walked into the tiny kitchen, pouring myself a glass of tap water to stop the shaking when my phone chimed with a cheerful, mocking text notification. I walked back, picking it up with a sinking feeling. The message was from my older brother, Tristan. I opened it, and my stomach twisted into a painful, suffocating knot. Tristan had sent a high-definition photograph of himself leaning back in a plush leather executive chair, his expensive custom Italian leather shoes resting disrespectfully on top of a massive mahogany desk. It was my custom-built desk at the Avery Global headquarters on Fifth Avenue, the exact desk where I had spent 80-hour weeks analyzing e-commerce logistics and saving our family company millions. In the background of the photo, 2 uniformed building security guards were actively tossing my personal belongings, my framed Ivy League degrees, and my industry awards into cheap brown cardboard boxes. Tristan was smiling directly at the camera, holding up a cup of premium coffee in a mocking, triumphant toast. The caption below the photo read, "Thanks for warming up my new corner office, sis. Dad says I get to take over all your top international accounts now. Have fun living in poverty in Brooklyn." The cruel, calculated words stared back at me, a perfect reflection of how my family operated. They didn't just want to cast me out. They wanted to thoroughly humiliate me and replace me instantly to prove I was entirely disposable. I took a deep, shuddering breath, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a broken spirit. I didn't type a single angry word in response. Instead, I simply blocked Tristan's number permanently, removing his ability to access my peace. But as I set the phone down, an urgent email popped into my primary inbox, marked with a high-priority red flag. The sender was Valerie, the brilliant CEO of Valerie Couture, the largest, most prestigious independent fashion client I had personally secured for Avery Global, generating over $100 million in annual revenue. I tapped the screen, scanning the text rapidly. It wasn't a standard congratulatory wedding message. It was a frantic, highly confidential warning sent from her private account. Valerie wrote that Tristan had called an emergency meeting with her executive board less than an hour ago, aggressively pitching a brand new exclusive logistics contract. But the real shock came in the second paragraph. Valerie stated that during his high-pressure sales pitch, Tristan presented a highly detailed AI-driven predictive data model to project global consumer trends. Valerie recognized the system instantly because I had shown her an early prototype. It was the exact proprietary algorithm I had spent the last 8 months secretly developing on my own time. It was my independent intellectual property, intentionally kept off the Avery corporate servers until the patent cleared. The only copies were stored on a highly encrypted flash drive locked inside the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. My blood ran completely cold, followed by a sudden, intense surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Tristan hadn't just stolen my office. He had actively picked the mechanical lock on my private desk drawer, stolen my physical drive, and was now parading my life's work around Manhattan to poach my most loyal clients. My family thought draining my bank accounts and stealing my blueprints would force me into total submission. They had no idea that by crossing this legal line, they had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy them. I looked up as Julian walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from the shower. He took one look at my fierce, determined expression and knew the war had officially begun. I opened my laptop on the small kitchen table, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I filed the expedited legal paperwork to officially register my own independent retail consulting firm. Valerie was already waiting for me to send over a master service agreement to move her entire $100 million portfolio away from Avery Global and directly under my new banner. However, securing a corporate client of that massive magnitude required a verified commercial physical footprint to pass their strict corporate compliance audits. I couldn't legally process their sensitive consumer data from a residential kitchen table. I needed a secure commercial office space in Manhattan, and I needed to sign a lease by the end of the business day. I dressed in my sharpest remaining tailored navy suit, grabbed my briefcase, and hit the pavement of New York City. I wasn't looking for a luxury high-rise suite. I just needed a modest, secure room with a commercial address to pass the compliance audit. My first stop was a brick commercial building in Soho. The property manager, a cheerful older man, enthusiastically reviewed my flawless credit history and outstanding professional references. He smiled warmly, handed me a preliminary lease agreement, and stated he just needed to run my name through the standard regional database before handing over the keys. I walked out onto the bustling sidewalk, feeling a spark of triumph, but the victory lasted exactly 45 minutes. My phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. It was the Soho property manager, but his voice was no longer warm. It was flat, trembling with an edge of nervous panic. He abruptly informed me that my application had been flagged by his superiors and officially denied, refusing to give a logical reason before hanging up. Confused, I immediately pivoted to a backup option in Midtown, meeting a commercial broker showing a converted warehouse space. The moment she typed my full legal name, Seraphina Avery, into her digital tablet, a loud priority notification pinged. The warm color completely drained from her face. She took a physical step away from me, stammered a frantic apology, and practically ran out of the building. By the time I reached a third rundown building in the Flatiron District, the desperate leasing agent looked at the bright red flag popping up on his monitor, turned to me with genuine pity, and licked his dry lips. He quietly explained that a highly confidential directive had just been issued across the entire New York real estate network. My vindictive father had personally leveraged his billionaire influence and massive retail property portfolio to universally blacklist my name. Any landlord or broker who dared to lease a single square foot of space to me would instantly lose all their lucrative Avery Global retail tenancies. Standing on the freezing sidewalk of Madison Avenue, the sheer magnitude of my father's financial tyranny pressed down on me like a physical weight. He was trying to completely erase my professional existence, but as I looked up, Julian's Ford Mustang pulled up to the curb and he handed me that heavy, unmarked matte black keycard. The unmarked matte black keycard felt surprisingly heavy in my palm, its sleek edges catching the sharp afternoon light of the financial district. I stared at it, then looked at Julian, who was navigating the roaring, chaotic traffic of Lower Manhattan with a calm, unbothered serenity. He didn't look like a man who had just bypassed a billionaire's citywide blockade. He looked like a man driving home from a casual grocery run. He turned the Ford Mustang down an exclusive subterranean ramp beneath the One World Trade Center, the crown jewel of New York's architectural power. This wasn't a standard public parking garage. The entrance was guarded by a reinforced steel gate and two heavily armed, uniformed security guards who looked capable of stopping an armored division. As the old car approached the security checkpoint, the rattling sound of our exhaust pipe echoed loudly against the pristine concrete walls. I braced myself for the inevitable rejection, expecting the guards to point us toward the exit. But the moment the lead security officer made direct eye contact with Julian, his rigid posture instantly shifted. He stood at absolute military attention, gave a deeply respectful nod, and swiped his master console to open the private executive gate without asking for a single piece of identification. Julian parked the car in a secluded, blacked-out VIP bay labeled for private trusts. He turned to me, his green eyes filled with a quiet, reassuring warmth, and told me that my father's influence stopped at the surface level of this city. He guided me through a private, frosted glass entrance that bypassed the bustling main lobby of the tower. We walked into a secure private elevator bay lined with polished obsidian panels. Julian stepped forward and swiped the matte black keycard over a concealed, glowing biometric sensor near the top of the panel. The elevator doors glided open with a soft, melodic chime that signaled absolute exclusivity. As we stepped inside, the doors sealed shut with a heavy, pressurized click, and the digital floor indicator began to rapidly ascend completely, bypassing the standard commercial floors, the observation decks, and the corporate suites. It didn't stop until it reached the absolute pinnacle of the skyscraper, the restricted penthouse level. When the elevator doors glided open, the sheer architectural magnificence of the space took my breath away. I stepped onto immaculate white marble floors that reflected the bright New York sky like a pristine mirror. The entire penthouse suite was wrapped in 30-foot floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed, 360-degree panoramic view of the entire Manhattan skyline, the Hudson River, and the distant horizon of New Jersey. The space was massive, spanning over 20,000 square feet of ultra-modern, high-end executive design. It was fully furnished with minimalist obsidian desks, state-of-the-art encrypted conference rooms, and a massive, glass-walled server room housing rows of blinking military-grade mainframe computers. This wasn't just an office. It was a corporate fortress, a space far more luxurious, technologically advanced, and imposing than my father's executive boardroom at Avery Global. I stood frozen in the center of the room, completely speechless, trying to reconcile this multi-million-dollar empire with the man who lived in a modest Brooklyn apartment and spent his weekends teaching art to underprivileged kids. Julian walked over to the largest corner office, pushing open the heavy glass door, and turned to look at me with a gentle, knowing smile. He casually explained that his nonprofit's International Board of Trustees had built this private hub for global operations but rarely utilized it. He told me it was entirely mine. A sudden surge of absolute, unadulterated clarity washed over me, burning away the last lingering remnants of my morning panic. Arthur Avery thought he had successfully suffocated my career by blacklisting my name from cheap, rundown commercial real estate offices in Soho. He had no idea that his cruelty had driven me straight into the most powerful, unassailable workspace in the entire country. I didn't waste a single second celebrating. I immediately marched into the corner office, threw my leather briefcase onto the pristine desk, and opened my laptop. I connected to the penthouse's ultra-secure encrypted satellite network and pulled up the master service agreement for Valerie Couture, entering my new commercial address, One World Trade Center Penthouse Suite. I officially initiated the emergency onboarding sequence for Valerie's $100 million luxury retail account. By midnight, my new servers were humming quietly, migrating her highly sensitive international consumer data away from the Avery Global mainframes and into my secure encrypted database. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously reviewing the core code of my proprietary AI predictive data model. I knew every predictive variable, every hidden market risk, and every subtle mathematical nuance embedded within that algorithm. Tristan had stolen the physical flash drive from my desk, but he lacked the fundamental high-level intelligence required to actually execute the system. He was playing with high-voltage digital fire, and I was going to gladly watch him burn his own fingers. The next morning, the bright New York sun poured through the massive windows of my penthouse fortress, illuminating my new reality. The corporate traps were set, and the stage was officially prepared for the ultimate confrontation. At exactly 10 o'clock, my personal phone began to ring loudly, vibrating against the polished surface of my obsidian desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name, Eleanor Avery. I stared at the glowing screen for a moment, fully aware that answering this call meant allowing her toxic, manipulative energy into my sanctuary. But I also knew that in the game of high-stakes corporate warfare, information was the ultimate currency. I swiped the screen and held the phone to my ear. Eleanor's voice floated through the speaker, dripping with a sickening, artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. She didn't ask if I had a place to sleep last night. She didn't ask how I was surviving after my father ruthlessly drained my private bank accounts. Instead, she cheerfully suggested that we meet for an urgent lunch, claiming that the horrific drama at the plaza had been nothing more than a terrible, unfortunate misunderstanding driven by high emotions and stubborn family pride. She told me she wanted to make peace, to sit down as mother and daughter and find a reasonable, structured path forward for my future. She named Le Bernardin, an exclusive 3-star Michelin French restaurant located in Midtown. I accepted her invitation, with a cold, level voice hanging up before she could utter another patronizing syllable. I knew exactly what this lunch was. It wasn't a maternal peace offering. It was a tactical reconnaissance mission ordered by my father to see if I was broken yet. I dressed in my sharpest, most intimidating tailored charcoal suit, pulled my hair into a tight professional bun, and left the tower. 30 minutes later, I walked into the hushed, ultra-luxurious dining room of Le Bernardin. The maitre d' immediately recognized me and guided me to a secluded private booth in the back of the restaurant where Eleanor was already sitting, elegantly sipping a glass of vintage white wine. My mother looked up, her ice-cold eyes instantly scanning my appearance, searching for any visible sign of financial desperation or emotional defeat. She looked visibly disappointed when she saw my flawless high-end suit and my absolute posture of total confidence. She smoothed her custom Chanel dress, offering a tight, hollow smile as I sat down across from her. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She immediately laid out my father's official ultimatum, presenting it as an act of profound family generosity. She told me that if I agreed to sign the legal paperwork to divorce Julian immediately, Arthur would completely restore my trust fund and return my personal savings. Furthermore, she stated that I would be allowed to return to Avery Global, but not as the chief of operations. Instead, I would serve as a subordinate consultant directly under my brother Tristan, who was now the undisputed head of the international accounts. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper, telling me that I needed to stop this pathetic, rebellious phase before I ruined my life permanently. She told me that raw talent meant absolutely nothing in the real world compared to the safety, protection, and unchecked power of the Avery family name. She expected me to sigh, nod, and accept the golden handcuffs. I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of pity for a woman who had completely sold her soul to designer labels and corporate portfolios. I set my water glass down with a slow, deliberate click, looked her dead in the eyes, and told her that I would rather starve on the streets of New York than spend another single second living as a slave to my father's fragile, toxic ego. I told her to keep the trust fund because the independent firm I had launched that morning would eclipse Avery Global before the quarter was over. Eleanor's face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage, her aristocratic composure completely shattering. Before she could scream at me, her expensive smartphone began to vibrate violently on the white tablecloth. The caller ID showed Tristan's name. She aggressively snapped up the phone, snapping at him to wait, but Tristan's voice was so loud and panicked that his terrified screams echoed clearly through the quiet restaurant. He was in total hysterical damage control. He had launched my proprietary AI predictive data model an hour ago to run a massive global Black Friday simulation for Valerie Couture. But because he didn't understand how to balance the server loads or input the hidden market variables, the algorithm had suffered a catastrophic, cascading system failure. The stolen software had completely glitched, shutting down Valerie Couture's entire global e-commerce infrastructure, freezing over $15 million in active consumer transactions and leaking highly sensitive client data onto public servers. Tristan was losing their biggest client in real time, and the Avery Global tech team had absolutely no idea how to stop the bleeding. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal suit jacket, and looked down at my trembling, horrified mother. I offered her a cold, triumphant smile and told her to tell Tristan to enjoy his new corner office because his time at the top of the corporate food chain had just officially expired. The heavy glass doors of Le Bernardin swung shut behind me, cutting off the high-pitched, panicked screeches of my mother as she scrambled to answer Tristan's frantic calls. Stepping out onto the concrete pavement of Midtown Manhattan, the raw energy of the city surged through my veins like high-voltage electricity. The cold wind howled down the canyon of skyscrapers, but I didn't feel the chill anymore. The corporate trap had been sprung, and my brother was actively drowning in the chaotic aftermath of his own arrogance. I pulled out my phone and watched the financial news alerts light up my screen in real time. The headlines were already breaking: Valerie Couture e-commerce platform suffers catastrophic global crash. Millions in holiday retail revenue frozen amid major data leak. As I walked toward the nearest subway station to head back down to my fortress at One World Trade Center, a sleek, blacked-out luxury SUV with tinted windows abruptly pulled up to the curb, screeching to a halt right in front of me. The rear passenger door swung open, revealing Valerie herself, sitting in the plush leather interior. The brilliant CEO looked completely disheveled, her eyes wide, with a mixture of intense fury and sheer desperation. She didn't waste time with formal greetings. She simply looked up at me and barked a frantic order to get into the vehicle immediately. I stepped inside the heavy door, sealing out the roaring noise of Manhattan with a dull thud as the driver slammed on the gas, racing down Madison Avenue. Valerie turned to me, her hands trembling as she held up a tablet displaying the crashing live analytics of her fashion empire. She told me that Tristan had promised her the world, assuring her board that his new AI-driven system would revolutionize their global distribution within minutes. Instead, the moment he executed the stolen code, the entire infrastructure locked up, trapping $15 million in active consumer transactions and exposing private data. She looked at me with deep, agonizing regret, admitting she should have trusted her gut and stayed loyal to my operational leadership. She pleaded with me to intervene, promising that if I could stop the cascading system failure, she would officially sign the contract to move her entire account to my new firm. I looked at the chaotic lines of broken code on her tablet, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. I told Valerie that I could absolutely fix the disaster, but it wouldn't happen inside the panicked, incompetent walls of the Avery Global headquarters. I told her we needed to go directly to my penthouse office at the top of the city where my secure, independent servers were already humming. Valerie didn't hesitate. She ordered her driver to change route and head straight for Lower Manhattan. As the SUV tore through the heavy traffic, my phone buzzed violently in my hand. The display showed an unknown corporate number, but I already knew the desperate identity of the person on the other end. I pressed the phone to my ear, and Tristan's arrogant, mocking demeanor was completely gone, replaced by a high-pitched, hysterical sob. He didn't bother saying hello. He immediately started begging me to tell him the master override password for the predictive data algorithm. He screamed that our father was pacing the executive boardroom, threatening to strip him of his titles if the Valerie Couture account fell apart before the stock market closed. I kept my voice perfectly level, icy, and devoid of any emotion. I reminded him of his toxic gloating on the sidewalk just a few hours ago when he claimed that inherited power would always crush raw intelligence. I told him that since he loved my corner office so much, he could sit in it and watch his career burn to ash. Tristan began to shriek, threatening to have me arrested for corporate sabotage, but I simply laughed a cold, empty laugh that cut through his panic. I told him that he was the one who picked the mechanical lock on my desk, stole my physical flash drive, and executed unpatented software he didn't have the brains to understand. I told him that any legal investigation into this catastrophic failure would expose his blatant intellectual property theft to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Before he could utter another desperate lie, I hung up the phone and blocked the corporate number permanently. I looked out the window as the SUV plunged into the subterranean executive entrance of One World Trade Center, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. The private obsidian elevator shot upward through the core of the skyscraper, the rapid acceleration forcing Valerie to grip the handrail in nervous anticipation. When the doors glided open at the penthouse level, she gasped aloud, completely stunned by the sheer scale, luxury, and technological power of my hidden fortress. She had expected a desperate, makeshift startup office in a cramped Brooklyn basement. Instead, she was standing inside a multi-million-dollar corporate command center that rivaled any sovereign wealth fund on Wall Street. I marched directly into my glass-walled corner office, threw my briefcase onto the desk, and booted up the master console. Julian was already there, quietly monitoring the encrypted satellite feeds, his presence a calm, solid anchor in the eye of the storm. I synchronized my secure server mainframes with Valerie Couture's crashed digital network, and within seconds, my screens lit up with thousands of lines of corrupted data. Tristan's amateur attempt to override the algorithm had triggered a defensive encryption loop that I had secretly built into the software as a safety precaution against theft. The system was doing exactly what I designed it to do, locking out unauthorized users who tried to exploit my intellectual property. Valerie stood behind my chair, her breath catching as my fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, deploying the proprietary master patch to stabilize the server loads and reroute the frozen consumer transactions through my secure payment gateways. For 2 agonizing hours, the penthouse became a high-stakes war room. I bypassed the broken Avery Global mainframes, entirely isolating their toxic architecture and migrating Valerie's entire international consumer base into my pristine cloud network. At exactly 3:45, just 15 minutes before the New York Stock Exchange closed for the day, the primary monitor flashed a bright, vibrant green. The cascading system failure was officially stopped. The data leak was securely plugged, and $15 million in frozen retail revenue successfully processed into Valerie's corporate accounts. Valerie let out a massive sob of relief, throwing her arms around me, declaring that I had just single-handedly saved her empire from total, irreversible annihilation. Without leaving my desk, I pulled up the electronic master service agreement we had prepared earlier and slid the digital tablet across the polished obsidian surface. Valerie grabbed the stylus and signed her name with fierce, unyielding determination, officially transferring her $100 million luxury account under the exclusive management of my new firm. As the confirmation email pinged through the secure network, my personal phone rang once again. This time the caller identification displayed my mother's name. I swiped to speakerphone, allowing her voice to echo through the pristine glass office. Eleanor was no longer commanding or condescending. Her voice was cracked, desperate, and laced with an ugly, trembling panic. She wept openly into the microphone, begging me to show mercy to my own flesh and blood. She revealed that the news of Valerie Couture's permanent defection had just leaked to the financial press, causing Avery Global's stock to plummet 40% in a matter of hours, wiping out billions in family market value. She told me that the board of directors was currently holding an emergency vote to forcibly remove my father as chairman and arrest Tristan for gross negligence. She tried to play the maternal card, whispering that family should always protect family, no matter what mistakes were made in the past. She pleaded with me to return to the Upper East Side penthouse tonight to sign a joint press release claiming the entire disaster was a planned corporate restructuring. I listened to her desperate pleas, feeling an icy wall of complete indifference solidify within my chest. I reminded her of how she stood on the stage at the plaza, smoothing her custom silk gown while publicly humming and laughing at my humiliation. I reminded her that she had happily watched my father drain my childhood savings and toss my hard-earned degrees into the trash just to break my spirit. I told her that she had never viewed me as a daughter. She had viewed me as a workhorse to be exploited for Tristan's unearned glory. I told her that the Avery Global Empire was built on a foundation of theft, cruelty, and unearned privilege, and it was finally time for the house of cards to collapse. Eleanor's desperate weeping instantly transformed into a vicious, venomous hiss. She cursed my name, screaming that I was an ungrateful monster who would never be welcomed back into high society, and vowed that my father would spend every remaining dime of his fortune to destroy my new business before the week was over. I looked up at Julian, who gave me a slow, proud nod of absolute support, and then looked back at the phone. I told my mother that she could tell Arthur to save his breath and his money, because in exactly 30 days, he wouldn't even be able to afford the rent on his Fifth Avenue offices. I ended the call, the sharp silence of the penthouse wrapping around me like a shield of pure, hard-won freedom. The line went dead, and the quiet hum of the penthouse servers was the only sound left in the room. The toxic, venomous voice of my mother faded into the vast skyline outside my 30-foot windows, leaving me with a clean, unburdened slate. Valerie Couture was staring at the digital monitors in absolute awe, her hand resting over her heart as she watched her company's financial indicators stabilize completely into a steady, thriving stream of green. She looked at me, her expression a mix of profound respect and genuine fear. She realized that the quiet, hard-working daughter who had spent a decade operating in the shadows of the Avery dynasty was no longer a hidden asset. I was now a lethal independent force, and I had just single-handedly controlled the narrative of the biggest financial disaster on Wall Street this quarter. Valerie adjusted her coat, turned to shake Julian's hand, and promised that her legal team would finalize the complete asset migration by the time the markets opened the following morning. She walked out of the penthouse, accompanied by 2 elite building security guards, leaving Julian and me alone in our glass fortress. The city below us began to light up, a massive sea of glittering yellow lights stretching out toward the Atlantic Ocean. Julian walked over to my desk, leaning his tall frame against the obsidian surface, and placed a warm hand on my shoulder. He looked at me with a quiet, fierce pride, asking what my next move was, now that the first domino had officially fallen. I leaned back in my executive chair, my eyes locking onto the live ticker symbols of the retail market. Avery Global stock was continuing its agonizing free-fall descent in after-hours trading, dropping an additional 12% as rumors of Tristan's gross negligence and impending SEC investigations began to circulate among institutional investors. I looked up at Julian and told him that a wounded animal is always the most dangerous right before it dies. My father was a prideful, vindictive billionaire who had spent 40 years crushing his corporate competitors with absolute brutality. He wouldn't sit quietly in his Upper East Side penthouse and watch his legacy dissolve into nothingness. He was going to try to scrub the digital evidence of his theft, and I needed to stop him before the night was over. I pulled up a secure, encrypted communication terminal on my laptop and dialed a private number that I had kept hidden in my personal records for 5 years. The call rang twice before a low, raspy voice answered. It was Marcus, the senior director of cybersecurity at Avery Global. Marcus was a brilliant old-school network engineer whom my father treated like a glorified IT servant, completely ignoring his immense talent and underpaying him for years. 2 years ago, when Marcus's daughter fell critically ill, my father had denied his request for an emergency corporate loan to cover the experimental medical treatments. I had quietly stepped in using my own independent consulting savings to wire Marcus the $80,000 he desperately needed to save his child's life. He had told me then that he owed me his life, and tonight I was calling in the favor. I didn't waste time with corporate small talk. I told Marcus that Tristan had breached my private desk, stolen my physical drives, and executed my proprietary source code without authorization, causing the catastrophic system failure that devastated Valerie Couture. I told him that my father's legal team would undoubtedly attempt to wipe the corporate servers clean at midnight to destroy the digital audit trail of Tristan's intellectual property theft before federal investigators could issue subpoenas. Marcus went dead silent on the other end of the line, the sound of heavy keyboard typing echoing in the background. After a long, tense minute, he whispered into the phone, confirming that my father had just ordered the external server arrays in their New Jersey data center to be completely purged in less than 3 hours. A cold, calculating fury washed over me. Arthur Avery thought he could use his massive wealth to overwrite reality and paint me as a disgruntled, lying former employee. I told Marcus to execute the emergency fail-safe protocol we had secretly mapped out a year ago during a routine system upgrade. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, knowing that defying a billionaire meant risking his entire career, but his loyalty to me was absolute. He told me he was deploying a hidden mirroring script that would automatically clone the entire corporate network, capturing every single internal email text message and deleted file, and reroute the data directly to my encrypted penthouse servers at One World Trade Center. For the next 2 hours, my monitors transformed into a digital war zone. Massive streams of data began to flood into my secure mainframe, flashing across the screens in endless lines of blue and silver code. I watched in real time as my father's high-priced corporate lawyers frantically exchanged panicked emails, explicitly discussing how to alter the metadata on Tristan's stolen flash drive to make it look like Avery Global had developed the AI predictive algorithm internally. They were actively conspiring to commit corporate fraud, and every single digital footprint was being captured, encrypted, and locked away in my unassailable fortress above the skyline. By midnight, the transfer reached 100%, and Marcus sent a final text. The truth is safe. They have no idea it's gone. The next morning, the financial world woke up to a total, unprecedented execution of the Avery family legacy. The opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange had barely rung when the front page of the Wall Street Journal dropped a devastating bomb that sent shockwaves through the global retail market. A massive anonymous leak had exposed the entire internal communication network of Avery Global, including the frantic midnight emails from their legal team detailing the deliberate cover-up of Tristan's intellectual property theft. The public revelation of corporate fraud, coupled with the permanent loss of the $100 million Valerie Couture account, triggered a massive, uncontrollable panic among institutional investors. Within 30 minutes, major shareholders began dump-selling their stock, causing a historic 55% crash that completely wiped out my father's billionaire status before noon. I sat at my desk, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, watching the dramatic collapse unfold on the massive television monitors lining my office walls. The SEC had officially issued emergency freeze orders on Avery Global's corporate assets, launching a federal criminal investigation into my brother and father for fraud, corporate espionage, and illegal manipulation of metadata. The house of cards that Arthur Avery had spent 40 years building with ruthless cruelty was completely disintegrating in real time. Suddenly, the glass doors of my penthouse slid open, and Julian walked in holding a certified legal document that had just been delivered to our security detail downstairs. He slid the heavy parchment across my desk, a sharp, knowing look in his eyes. It was an official emergency liquidation decree issued by the bank that held the primary commercial mortgage on the iconic Avery Global headquarters on Fifth Avenue. Because my father's personal net worth had plummeted below the required debt-to-equity ratio specified in his multi-million-dollar credit agreements, the bank had triggered an immediate margin call, demanding full repayment of his $300 million commercial loan within 24 hours. If he failed to pay, the historic skyscraper would be forced into immediate foreclosure and auctioned off to the highest bidder on the steps of the New York Supreme Court. My father was entirely out of liquid cash. His private accounts were trapped under the federal freeze order, and his entire life's work was about to be obliterated. I picked up my pen, signed a master authorization form that I had been preparing with Julian's private trust network over the last month, and looked up at my husband. Julian offered a calm smile, confirming that his international trust had just approved a $350 million distressed asset acquisition fund under my independent firm's name. I had the liquid capital, the unassailable legal evidence, and the complete corporate leverage to execute the ultimate hostile takeover. I stood up, smoothing the lines of my tailored black suit, and told Julian that it was time to return to the Upper East Side penthouse to deliver the final crushing blow to the people who thought their money could buy my absolute obedience. An hour later, I stepped out of the private elevator directly into the grand foyer of my parents' multi-million-dollar high-rise residence. The once immaculate, silent penthouse was in a state of absolute chaotic ruin. Expensive crystal vases were overturned, designer clothes were thrown carelessly across the marble floors, and the air was thick with the suffocating scent of cheap scotch and pure, unadulterated desperation. My father, Arthur Avery, was sitting on a velvet sofa, his expensive silk tie completely undone, his face pale and hollowed out by age and defeat. My mother, Eleanor, was pacing back and forth near the panoramic windows, weeping hysterically into a tissue while Tristan sat on the floor, staring blankly at the wall with bloodshot eyes, fully realizing that a federal prison sentence was waiting for him. The heavy sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor caused all three of them to snap their heads up in unison. The moment Arthur saw me standing there looking radiant, powerful, and completely unbothered, a flash of his old dictatorial rage flared in his eyes. He stumbled to his feet, slamming his glass of scotch onto the mahogany coffee table, and screamed at me, calling me an ungrateful traitor who had destroyed her own family for a penniless nobody. He demanded that I use my new connection with Valerie Couture to issue a public statement retracting the data leak, threatening to completely cut me out of his will permanently if I didn't save his company before the day ended. I stood perfectly still in the center of the ruined room, looking down at the broken tyrant with an icy level stare that completely withered his remaining anger. I told him to shut his mouth and sit down because he no longer had the right or the power to raise his voice in my presence. I opened my leather briefcase, pulled out the certified foreclosure and acquisition documents from the bank, and tossed them carelessly onto the table right in front of his trembling hands. I told him that I hadn't come here to negotiate a truce or listen to his pathetic, outdated demands. I told him that my firm had just officially bought out his entire $300 million commercial mortgage from the bank, making me the exclusive legal owner of the Avery Global headquarters on Fifth Avenue. Arthur's face turned an ugly, suffocating shade of purple as he scanned the legal signatures, his hands shaking so violently the papers rattled in the quiet room. Eleanor let out a sharp, choked gasp, dropping her phone to the floor, while Tristan slowly looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. I leaned over the table, pressing my palms against the wood, and looked my billionaire father dead in the eyes, delivering my final, unyielding ultimatum. I told him that he had exactly 24 hours to sign over his remaining corporate shares to my independent firm for $1, or I would personally hand over the complete midnight server audit logs to the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning, ensuring that he and Tristan would spend the rest of their natural lives rotting inside a federal penitentiary. The suffocating silence inside the ruined Upper East Side penthouse stretched out so long that the distant muffled sounds of the Manhattan traffic below felt like they belonged to another dimension. Arthur Avery sat completely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the certified bank foreclosure documents bearing the corporate stamp of my new independent firm. The single-dollar bill I had tossed onto the mahogany table rested directly on top of the signature line, a stark, humiliating symbol of his absolute downfall. My mother, Eleanor, had stopped her hysterical weeping. She stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her manicured hands gripping her face in sheer, unadulterated terror as she looked at her husband, waiting for him to wave his billionaire magic wand and make the reality disappear. But there was no magic left in the Avery legacy. Beside the sofa, Tristan slowly pulled himself up from the floor, his expensive tailored trousers wrinkled and stained with spilled alcohol. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man who realized that his next home would likely be a concrete cell in a federal penitentiary. He looked at Arthur, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whisper as he begged our father to sign the papers. Tristan whimpered that the federal prosecutors were already building their case and that my encrypted server logs were the only things keeping the Department of Justice from executing an immediate arrest warrant. The golden child was openly begging the workhorse for a scrap of mercy. Arthur slowly raised his head, his face looking incredibly withered and defeated under the harsh afternoon sunlight filtering through the penthouse windows. The fiery, dictatorial tyrant who had stood on the grand stage at the plaza just days ago, publicly stripping me of my dignity and my livelihood, was completely gone. He looked at me, his lips trembling as he asked how Julian, a penniless, low-life charity worker from Brooklyn, could possibly possess the multi-million-dollar financial leverage required to buy out a sovereign Wall Street commercial mortgage in less than 24 hours. He was still trying to rationalize his defeat through the narrow, superficial lens of wealth and social status. I offered my father a cold, level smile, refusing to give his fragile ego the satisfaction of an explanation. I told him that while he was busy spending 40 years exploiting his employees and playing golf with corrupt politicians, Julian was quietly building a global network of hyper-loyal, ultra-wealthy philanthropic investors who actually cared about changing the structural fabric of the world. I told him that Julian's international trust operated with more liquid capital than Avery Global had ever seen in its entire history, and they had gladly funded my hostile takeover because they believed in my vision, not an outdated family name. I stepped forward, tapping my finger heavily against the signature line, and told Arthur that his time was officially up. With a slow, agonizingly heavy hand, Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his gold-plated fountain pen. His fingers shook so violently that he could barely uncap the tip. He stared at the single-dollar bill resting on the table, a pathetic, insulting compensation for the multi-billion-dollar retail empire he had built from the ground up through decades of ruthless, bloodless efficiency. He pressed the pen to the paper, his signature erratic and jagged, officially transferring 100% of his remaining corporate shares' voting rights and structural control of Avery Global over to my independent firm. The moment the final loop of his name was completed, he dropped the pen onto the table, burying his face in his hands as a low, broken sob escaped his chest. I snatched the signed legal documents from the table, checking every line with methodical corporate precision to ensure there were no hidden loopholes or administrative errors. Once I was fully satisfied that the transition of power was legally unassailable, I slid the papers smoothly back into my leather briefcase and snapped the lock shut with a sharp, echoing click. I looked down at my family one last time, feeling absolutely no sense of anger, vengeance, or malicious joy. All I felt was a profound, beautiful sense of total, unburdened freedom. I told them that my corporate legal team would arrive at the penthouse tomorrow morning at precisely 9 o'clock to oversee their immediate eviction from the property, as the high-rise residence was legally registered under Avery Global corporate assets. I turned on my heel and walked out of the penthouse, my heels clicking firmly against the marble floor as I stepped into the private elevator. As the doors glided shut, sealing out the sight of my ruined family forever, I let out a long, deep breath that I felt like I had been holding for 30 years. The golden cage was officially dismantled, and I was stepping out into a world that I had built completely on my own terms. The elevator shot down to the subterranean garage where Julian was waiting for me inside the Ford Mustang, the low familiar rumble of the engine serving as a comforting grounding anchor after the high-stakes corporate warfare above. When I slid into the passenger seat, Julian didn't ask about the papers or the confrontation. He simply looked at my face, saw the absolute clarity and peace in my eyes, and smiled warmly as he reached out to lock his hand securely in mine. He shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the garage, steering us away from the elite residential towers of the Upper East Side and heading back down toward the financial district. As the car sped across the Brooklyn Bridge, the massive glittering glass structure of One World Trade Center loomed majestically ahead of us, reflecting the brilliant golden hues of the New York sunset. Tomorrow, the signs on the Fifth Avenue headquarters would change, and a new era would officially begin.